been discovered, although there were deaths, but a county that was hit really hard by this hurricane. So the question is, when you're looking at this, and you and I were talking about this, Jill, when you got 35 mail routes down 2 weeks after the storm, those aren't the kind of mail routes that are just because a truck got wrecked or because it was too muddy out. That means knocked over bridges. That means roads that are inaccessible, roads that the U.S. Postal Service cannot get to. And we're 30 days out from an election. If the Post Service can't get there, if rescuers are having difficult times getting there, then how are those people going to really be able to vote? So I was trying to talk to the chairman about that sort of thing and get his eye on what the RNC plans to do for this rather important state and a conservative part of it, where a lot of voters, from your personal experience and others, really are eager to have their say in this upcoming election. But the reality of the situation on the ground is it's still pretty dire. There are still a lot of people who are suffering. There are still, unfortunately, a lot more dead to be found in this. And so right now it's still a humanitarian response. And while the state legislature, with the support of the RNC, has backed moves to make it easier to vote, to extend some of the deadlines to vote, to allow more people to be enfranchised or have that protected, you still have to worry about that. And that worry, according to the chairman, comes secondarily to the humanitarian aspect.
Absolutely. And Chris, I mean, the devastation there has just been absolutely horrible. But do you find that Republicans are coming together to find a way to make sure that maybe it's the early voting, maybe it's the mail-in voting, maybe it's voting that day? Do you think that they're coming together with some kind of plan, hopefully within the next month, for people to be able to at least get to a location?
They say they are, and I know in their hearts that they want to be. But my experience with Republican get out the vote effort is they don't take it seriously enough, and they never really have. They kind of just assume that if they build it, people will come. Whereas Democrats have shown over the past number of years that a well-oiled machine that enlists the administrative state and the bureaucratic state to get people out to vote, that enlists church pastors to get people out to vote, it enlists armies of volunteers who are willing to drive folks from Democratic neighborhoods, and it's basically always that. I think past actually, who was holding them back from being able to kind of have the same get out the vote efforts that Democrats have been able to have. That is over now. Their hands are untied, and at the same time, they've learned a lot of the lessons of 2020 when they got their butts kicked on the get out the vote game, and they got their butts kicked on the legal shenanigans that people were willing to play, where your poll watchers are being kicked out repeatedly, where you kept on having to go to Democratic judges to get court orders multiple times in a day just to be able to observe the process, where they had organized protesters from the left with all printed signs and T-shirts saying count every vote, which in parentheses means even the illegal ones, on the streets, completely ready to do this. That was a Republican Party that wasn't ready for it. It's a far cry from what you saw in 2000 with the Republican response in Florida, which was very well organized, very aggressive. And they're hopeful that this round will be significantly more ready than previously. But right now, just like so much in D.C., it's a lot of talk.
Well, Chris, let's turn our eyes over to the Democrats right now, because according to Politico, Tim Walz is going to launch a media campaign to target male voters for Kamala Harris. And the first on the agenda was a one-on-one interview with Good Morning America's Michael Strahan. Let's take a listen.
And when it comes to President Biden and the presidency, would you or do you see anything that you would have done different?
Yeah, and look, as a governor, I was asked to be governor of this state when Donald Trump was president and when Joe Biden was there. And I watched Donald Trump dismiss the COVID pandemic. I watched him drive an economy into the ground. And I watched Joe Biden and Kamala Harris pick those pieces up. And I think for all of us, we make decisions, we reanalyze afterwards. I think the thing that drew me to this ticket, and I think what the vice president's talking about, is that her values on these hasn't changed. They have been working for the middle class. They've been doing all they can to make sure prices come down. They're protecting reproductive care.
So it makes me want to ask you, do you think that Biden's done everything right?
Well, look, I don't know if any of us do everything right, but I can tell you he's done everything in the best interest of the American public.
There were so many buzzwords in there. Walz also was talking about how being a coach prepared him for politics and all these other masculine topics. So is this going to work?
I could see how if you're some kind of beta in D.C. that you would think that all the men tune into Good Morning America to get their cues. But that is simply not true. not only are Democrats unable to reach men, and that's not just white men or non-college educated men. It's white men, black men, young men, old men, Hispanic men. When you basically united and half of the population against your policies and your ideas, you don't have a lot of folks who seem to be really even have an understanding of what a man is. They use terms like toxic masculinity and say that a man is a person who cries and does all these other different things. It's just kind of missing the point. Like, of course, guys have to be sensitive. That's part of being a head of a household or being a son or being a brother. But that is not the core. The core is very different, and they seem to miss that. I mean, just earlier today, there was an incredible TikTok ad that's gone viral about how I'm man enough to be this, I'm man enough to be that, and I'm man enough to vote for Kamala Harris. Well, if you dig into those actors, they're not actually farmers and mechanics and weightlifters and fathers or anything. I mean, 4/5 of them are either single or gay. This is much more representative of Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. than it is of the people that they're literally acting as. And it's funny to watch the outreach. Walz, they're trying to do a reset. Walz was supposed to be this guy from the beginning, but he got completely sidetracked by the fact that he's a pathological liar and everything else about him and his extremely left-wing policies. So that he's basically been on an apology tour. And I think it's a little too late to change that narrative.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, in some ways, I think Tim Walz appeals much more to women because he's kind of this cuddly old guy who laughs and he's like a coach and stuff. But, you know, them using these words like toxic masculinity, them really demonizing men in many ways and running solely on really only speaking to the single women and out there. How do you think that's going to play out for the Democrats? Do you think it's going to backfire for them? Do you think Tim Walz is reaching any of these young men in many cases who are a little bit more interested in Donald Trump?
We have about 60 seconds, Bedford.
So Tim will probably give a slight veneer to this whole agenda. I think James Carville's gotten a lot of trouble for this, but he's completely correct that the Democratic Party is dominated by preachy females. And it's not something you can see it reflected in the polls. It's not just Chris from Boston's obnoxious point of view, although I agree with the polls on this one, and James Carville. They're dominating it. So Tim Walz gives like a little veneer of masculinity to the ticket, or at least he's supposed to. But when you compound it with the lies, you compound it with the tampons in the bathrooms and all these other really creepy, weird things, the package, it just doesn't sell to anything other than single white women.
Well, Chris, go make masculinity great again there in D.C. We're counting on you because clearly no one else is going to do it. Have a great weekend, Chris.
I'm literally about to be moving rocks this evening to help a neighbor out. That's how you do it.
I knew we could count on you. We'll catch you later, Chris. Thanks so much.
See you next week.
Delano Squires will explain why he thinks the NAACP cares more about the White House than black households. Next. Well, every time I get it, it's my favorite delivery, GoodRanchers.com. When you pick them, you're choosing more than delicious American meat. You're choosing to support local farms and ranches in the United States and stand up for transparency and our safety in food supply, because Good Ranchers partners exclusively with American farms to provide you with pasture-raised beef, chicken, pork, wild-caught seafood that you can actually trust. And it's not going to have the antibiotics, the hormones, or the seed oils in it that you don't want. By shopping from GoodRanchers.com, you're making a statement about the kind of values that you stand for, which are quality, hard work, dedication to the American tradition. And right now, Good Ranchers is running their presidential promo. So for a limited time, you can get a free add-on for a whole 4 years, which is good until the next presidential election. And that means when you subscribe to any of their boxes, you get to decide if you want free chicken breast, Angus ground beef, apple smoked with bacon, or wild-caught salmon in your order for 4 years. And it's a perfect way to ensure that you have high-quality American meat in your kitchen. And I love that they come in vacuum sealed packages so I can decide how much I want on any given night. And it's less time prepping and more time enjoying. In a time when every dollar matters right now, Good Ranchers gives you more value without compromising on quality. So don't miss out. Use my code Jill to claim this presidential promo worth up to $1,200 and bring 100% American meat to your family meals, good through 2028. It's GoodRanchers.com, code Jill. GoodRanchers.com. American meat delivered.
Dear Dad, I don't say this enough, but you're my hero. I know you're not feeling this election, but please do me a favor. Vote. Our Black history, my access to healthcare, and our voting rights are under attack. Extreme politicians want to take away our voice and our vote. Our future, my future, is on the ballot right now.
This recent NAACP ad sends an interesting message to Black men. The White House matters more than their own house. Delano Squires is a Heritage Foundation research fellow and contributor for Fearless with Jason Whitlock, and he wrote this piece for Blaze News, and he joins us now to discuss this. So, Delano, can you break down this messaging that we see here in this campaign?
Well, the messaging is pretty typical when it comes to Democrats and Black men. The underlying message is always the same. We value you for your vote first and foremost. To the extent we value you for anything else, it's, and I hate to say it this way, it's your corpse. Because if you are George Floyd or someone who's killed either by a vigilante or a police officer, we can use that for political activism. Or we value you for your seed, right? Because in today's world, many Democratic voters want babies, but not husbands. So it's one of those three things that Democrats talk about when they show up to speak to Black men. And in this ad, it was primarily about voting. You can hear the young lady says, you know, you're my dad, you're my hero, and then quickly get into all of the talking points that you would expect from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and it seems like the ad was really focused on guilting the men to make them feel like, oh, this is my daughter. She wants me to vote for this person. And yet, what has Biden or Harris even done for these people's kids? What has he done for families? He's just put them in a more difficult spot than they were 4 years ago. So do you think it's kind of trying to get these men to vote against their instincts, even when the way that they want to vote may actually be better for their families?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think first and foremost, I would hope that within my home, I'm the one who's educating my daughter in terms of political realities and what each party stands for, their worldview, their principles, their values. I would hope that's the case. But then to your point, in terms of the messaging, it always is, it's guilt. And guilt is one part of what I call sign language, right? This is a term sometimes you'll hear some men on the internet, as they refer to women on dating, they'll say a lot of women use sign language in speaking to men. It's shame, it's insults, it's guilt, and it's the need to be right. And because Democrats are deaf to the needs and particularly the values of millions of Black men, their default is to speak in sign language. And you saw this last night with President Obama showed up to, it looked like Harris Walz campaign headquarters and basically chastised a group of Black men and said, you guys are not as excited to vote for her as you were to vote for me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, most of these guys were probably in grade school when you ran for president the first time. So this is how they speak to men in general and Black men in particular. It's always with sign language.
Yeah, Delano, we actually have a clip of Barack Obama speaking last night. Let's go ahead and take a listen to it.
When you have a choice that is this clear, when on the one hand you have somebody who grew up like you, knows you, went to college with you, understands the struggles and pain and joy that comes from those experiences. He's had to work harder and do more and overcome and achieves the second highest office in the land.
So break that down. And my question is, like, when I listen to that, how bad must their internal poll numbers be for Barack Obama to come out and say this last night?
Well, my instinct is to think that they're pretty bad, but this is just a replay of what they did in 2020. Because in 2020, the notion that even a small percentage of Black men were going to vote for Donald Trump as opposed to Joe Biden made Maxine Waters, Jim Clyburn, a bunch of Democratic talking heads, politicians, functionaries come out and preemptively chastise black men, saying, your ancestors are going to be ashamed of you. And how can you do this? One radical feminist professor named Brittany Cooper said that black men considering voting for Donald Trump, this was in 2020, that they just wanted the power and privilege that white men have. So it's quite possible that it may only be a sliver. My gut instinct is that at least 25% of black men will vote for Trump in this election. That's just my gut. So I think if they are seeing something similar, it explains why they are reacting this way. But again, here you have Barack Obama in Pittsburgh, and I went to college in Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, so I know the city fairly well, chastising a group of men, many of whom were too young to vote for him in 2008, many of whom come from truly working class neighborhoods, and he's trying to convince them that a woman who was born to 2 PhDs, who spent her formative years in Canada, is just like them in some, sort of meaningful way. And I don't know that many guys are buying that.
Yeah, I did think that was funny because Kamala Harris from California, I mean, she really doesn't relate to people of Pittsburgh at all, as you were saying. But even if the Republicans can get a sliver of, let's say, black men to move over to their side voting for Trump Vance instead of Kamala, how do you think the Democrats are going to react? Because it seems like a lot of the time their response is kind of like Obama did. It's, we're going to shame you, or like the ad did, we're going to guilt you. We're going to kind of just make you do what we want, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, we need to actually change what we're doing and we need to speak to these people better. But instead, it seems like they always go for the negative, the position of force almost.
I mean, they're doing what their instinct tells them to do, right? So the Democratic Party is a party of matriarchy. And when they can't get men to behave in the ways that they want them to, their instinct is to try to shame them, to criticize them, to call them misogynist and sexist. So my sense is that if again, 25% of black men vote for Trump, they're going to double down on that in the media. The only question is whether or not that percentage leads to a Trump victory, because it's possible that black men in cities that are in blue states may vote for Trump, so they could see Trump could see a spike but still lose, certain states. But if the black men in Atlanta and Philadelphia and Milwaukee vote for Trump, and that puts him over the top in 3 swing states, 3 key states, then black men in general should expect to be chastised and derided and insulted in 2025, in January 2025, the same way you all remember this, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump in 2016. It will be that times 10 on MSNBC, on CNN, on The Root, on The Griot, and Essence Magazine. So both in mainstream sort of corporate left-wing media, in addition to the media platforms that are catered to the black community, it will be nonstop chastisement, insulting. Just imagine Joy Reid, right? Newly, sort of closely cropped Donald Trump toupee in place, saying these black men that voted for Trump just want to be, they're white supremacists in blackface. It'll be that type of thing. If both black men vote for Trump in higher numbers, and that puts him over the top in key states.
Well, Delano, yesterday we were talking about Trump going to speak at Madison Square Garden. Today, you're bringing up the fact that you might think that 25% of black men might be voting for Trump. Things are changing. It's not the same old, same old. So we will have an interesting 3.5 weeks. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Our next guest will set the record straight on the Biden economy. Next. Big Blaze fan and you like what we do around here and you want to have a way to let other people know that you're watching and listening and you love everything that Blaze Media has to offer. Well, we have all of our stuff over at shopblazemedia.com. We have everything from the Blaze Heritage and Blaze Media collections to Agua Donkeys and our Trump Vance 2024 merch. It's everything from jackets and t-shirts and mugs and flags. There's a ton of stuff over there that you're going to love. So go to shopblazemedia.com today and check out all the cool stuff from right here at Blaze Media. And be sure to use the promo code BLAZE10 to get 10% off your entire order. It's shopblazemedia.com, promo code BLAZE10 for 10% off. Go do it today.
According to the latest report from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, 2024's federal budget deficit has now hit $1.8 trillion. That's with a T. It's the highest level in 3 years. We're getting this news as economists try to parse the presidential candidates' plans to see how much they would add or maybe hopefully subtract at some point.
Despite claims from the White House of a strong economy, some argue that this financial situation is a ticking time bomb. Now the national debt is exceeding 120% of GDP, and interest payments are outpacing national defense spending. Let me say that again. Pull a Donald Trump here. Interest payments are now outspending national defense. So are we living in an economic illusion? Here to break down all of this and give us the growing deficit and how it could impact everything for you, from your taxes to the future of the middle class, is Carol Roth. She's a recovering investment banker and author of You Will Own Nothing. So, Carol, what are the risks of keeping a $2 trillion deficit, even when we aren't even technically at war right now?
It's a perfect analogy, and it's exactly where I was going to go. Imagine having wartime emergency spending on the regular. That is what we are living with. And that is destructive in any sort of financial backdrop. But Jill, as you said, we have 120% debt to GDP ratio. That is about double the high end of what is sustainable long term. So if we were any other country in the world, if we didn't have the biggest military, we didn't have the biggest economy, if we didn't have the world's reserve currency, if we didn't have the world's trading currency, we would be in a sovereign debt crisis. We have been able to buy ourselves some time, but that party doesn't go on forever. And because we are all of those things, if we have an economic collapse, it could take the entire world down with it. So this is a very serious issue. And to my chagrin, in all of the debates that we've had, we haven't had any of the moderators bring up what are you going to do about this national debt crisis we're facing. And we haven't gotten really a good answer from either of the candidates on that because the media just tends to ignore it.
Absolutely. And this national debt issue, it seems like I don't know if it will be addressed by any party at this point because there's no incentive to do so. But at what point will it get to where we can't pay, let's say, the interest payment, where it's like, okay, we have to change something. We have to do something different because we can't continue like this anymore. I think it may take some kind of wake up call like that in order for there to be anything done. So what would kind of have to happen in your mind for there to be a wake up call like that?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. Human nature, and particularly American human nature, is to fix problems after they happen, not to be proactive when you see this problem. Now, if I could tell you exactly the point in time, I would be on a mega yacht in the Mediterranean right now and not having this lovely conversation with you ladies. But I do think what's going to happen first is something where they're going to continue to inflate away the debt. So basically, we only have so many levers to deal with. We can collect a certain amount of taxes, but we know at some point that slows down the economy and they end up taking in less. They can curb spending, which, as you said, is politically not that popular. And then if you're left with nothing else, you have all of this debt. Well, when you have nobody left to buy it, what happens? The Federal Reserve comes in. They have to print money from nowhere to go ahead and absorb that debt. And that ends up being highly inflationary, which is one of the drivers of the inflation that we've been living through for the last 3.5 years. So I can see a scenario where we have this massive ongoing inflation first. And I think that is the reality. The worst case scenario is that we end up in some sort of a war to do a financial reset, because not every war brings about a financial reset, but every financial reset that we have had in modern times has been preceded by a war. And with everybody being tied to the US dollar and affecting the global economy, if things get too bad and they need to decide that, hey, we need to reset the debt levels, or maybe we need to raise the price of gold, or we need to find some way to reset the stakes here, there needs to be a catalyst to that. everyone's not just going to agree. You're not going to get, China and France and the US and everyone just coming to the table for fun to do this. That could be the worst case scenario. So no matter the situation, what it means is if you're in the middle or working class, you are going to see best case ongoing inflation. And that means every dollar that you're working for is buying less, and you're really seeing your quality of life impacted. And I don't think that people have gotten their heads wrapped around it. Otherwise, we would be having marches on Washington about this issue when there's been relative, maybe some complaining at the grocery store, but we're not seeing that level of demonstration or activism.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we all do know for sure is that we don't have a willing political class to stop the spending. But you went to the personal consumer. So I want to take you back to an old commercial. Do you remember there was a guy in the backyard and he goes, "I'm in debt up to my eyeballs," as he's cleaning his pool? I want to talk to you about just consumer debt and the way that everybody is putting money on their credit cards. How is that adding to this illusion right now that we have a good economy?
Yeah, so we have sort of two aspects here. You have the government that is window dressing with their deficit spending, and then you have the consumer who is desperate to keep pace with their quality of life. They're trying to pay for food, they're trying to pay for rent, maybe take a trip from time to time. And so we're seeing this on their personal balance sheet happen in a couple of places. One is the personal saving rate, and that is way down. It's under 3%, 2 point something percent. At this point, the historic average is about 8.5%, and pre-COVID, February 2020, I think it was around 7.7%. So we're seeing that people are saving less, they're putting less into saving. At the same time, we're seeing that credit cards and other forms of personal household debt are going through the roof. And that's in areas, not just for buying a home, but for direct spending. So as I said, the credit cards, the automobile debt, and so on and so forth. So you have a consumer who's been doing everything they can to keep pace, and their personal balance sheets have been wrecked, but it looks like the consumer is strong and doing well because they continue to spend until they run out of runway. I think the big catalyst for that could be a shift in the jobs market. And that's why you have the Fed, with all of this mixed data, lowering rates, because they too are concerned that if they get some softness in the jobs market, it really could send everything tumbling in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a bit more about the personal finance aspect, because I think something that's been pushed a lot are things like Afterpay, the buy now, pay later, these increasing interest rates on people. And so people think, oh, okay, I can afford this right now. I'll just kind of pay for it later. And eventually these things really rack up for people and the interest rates are crazy. At what point do you think there should be maybe more regulation on these things? Should there be some kind of just messaging to people saying, hey, this is going to catch up eventually? I know you mentioned people trying to keep up their current lifestyle, but sometimes we've also seen, even when the economy is, let's say, not so good or inflation is bad, we'll see, Christmas spending is through the roof or something like that. And of course, it's totally up to people to do what they want to do, but also it does come back to people in a way, just like how we talked about the national debt. So what would kind of be your advice to people with the personal finance there?
Yeah, I mean, it's so frustrating because we're seeing these massive balances at the time when we have very high interest rates. I got one of my credit card notices, and I pay off my credit card balance every month, always have. But if I were to not pay it off, it was something like an average percentage yield of over 31% a year. That is incredibly insane. Now, we all pay for people to be educated in this country. I do not understand why there's not financial literacy and economic literacy, unless you take a very cynical view, which is that they want consumers to go into debt to fuel the economy and to be beholden to the government to solve their problems. So I think this is best solved through individual responsibility and having more personal financial literacy programs. I know the idea of capping credit card rates sounds great in theory, but what happens, like with any other price control, is it ends up having these outsized and unexpected effects. So if you are somebody with maybe okay credit or bad credit, guess what? You're not going to be able to get credit from banks anymore. And that means people who are, really looking for credit instead of going to the bank that they maybe don't like to deal with are going to go to Big Jimmy and Little Jimmy, and they're not so great with their bankruptcy policy. So we don't want people doing that. And certainly even the people who do have good credit, they're going to find that, whatever rate they're paying is more expensive because of these artificial caps. So I know that's a way that we want to try to solve the problems, but we don't want to create new problems in doing so. So letting people understand financial literacy, and I know personal austerity isn't a lot of fun, but the best path to wealth has been shown to be delayed gratification. And I know right now people are just struggling for food and rent, so this is a difficult message, and I'm certainly not trying to poo-poo that in any way, but finding the areas that are more discretionary and cutting back there for some period of time so that you have the buffer and that you don't have to be taking on this debt, which is just going to compound and eat away at your ability to have a stress-free life and to create wealth. That's what you really have to dig deep and do right now.
Carol, I could talk to you for the whole hour, but thanks so much for your time. I always love when you come on the show.
Always love being with you guys. Thanks for having me.
When we come back, we'll reveal how Joe Biden let a would-be terrorist into the country. Don't go anywhere. We have some exciting news to share. We are launching Frontier. It's a stunning quarterly magazine that's filled with the bold ideas and original journalism. And they put powerful voices in there like Matt Taibbi, Chris Rufo, Mark Levin, and Glenn Beck. And Frontier is packed with the thoughtful commentary and stunning photography that highlights people who refuse to back down. And you can get it through Blaze Unlimited. We're taking another step, fighting back against the state-run media, all the propaganda, all the forces that are trying to tear down this country. As a founding member of Blaze Unlimited, you'll get exclusive access, VIP perks, and a chance to help shape Blaze Media's future. It's not just a magazine, it's a movement against the mainstream media. Founding member spots are limited, so act fast and join the fight right now for the truth. If you're ready to stand with us, visit blazeunlimited.com/BNT and let's stand together. Let's push back and keep the spirit of America alive. Join Blaze Unlimited today. We're just getting started. It's blazeunlimited.com/BNT. The Biden-Harris administration imported an Afghan national who was recently arrested for plotting a massacre of American citizens on Election Day. Here to discuss is Blaze News reporter Joe MacKinnon, who wrote this story for theblaze.com. So, Joe, how did this individual get into the country?
Well, that's a very good question, and comes after a great deal of criticism that was treated as suspect, as xenophobic, racist, and the like by not just Democrats and some faith leaders, but also by some nominal Republicans, Adam Kinzinger and Mitch McConnell, to name two. He came in on September 9th, just shy of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, where his countrymen murdered thousands of American citizens. And he came right on the tail end of the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I should say the Biden-Harris administration's botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it's disputed whether he came on a humanitarian parole or whether he actually was approved for a special immigrant visa. But one thing is certain, he got through. He entered into the homeland and settled in Oklahoma City. And there's been a lot of rumors advanced by the regime or the administration, suggesting that he was radicalized here over the last 3 years. But one thing that is certain is that he really did immerse himself in jihadist propaganda. There's evidence of him reading to his daughter and nephew about the glories of martyrdom. And mind you, this is all happening on American soil. This was a person who was onboarded with tens of thousands of others in a hurried fashion. And he also was vetted. Now, the DHS Inspector General had admitted in 2022 that this vetting process was all but useless. And that might be a little bit hyperbolic on my part, but I quote his conclusion here. DHS may have admitted or paroled individuals into the U.S. to pose a risk to national security and the safety of local communities. Well, sure enough, a risk manifested. And even though there was a little bit of leading from the FBI, which has become particularly good at that, this individual, Nasir Tawhidi, planned on murdering as many Americans as possible on November 5th at the polling stations. And had he been successful, and he did have a co-conspirator who's unnamed in the criminal complaint, but had he been successful, you would have had something, I think, akin to the Bataclan attack in 2015 in France, or perhaps the Crocus City Hall attack earlier this year in Moscow. So a nightmarish situation, entirely preventable and expedited ultimately by the current administration.
Wow, Joe. Well, thank you so much for reporting on this issue. I think what really just sounds the alarm bells for me is just how many people have been crossing under the Biden-Harris administration. And I'm, of course, glad this was caught ahead of time. But how can we be sure something like this won't be happening again? I mean, I think the threat of crime, even just beyond, let's say, drug trafficking and other things that are often talked about, are really going to go up even when it comes to terrorism. So what's kind of your expectation, even as far as just safety within the next month leading up to the election?
Well, in this circumstance, you were dealing with people coming from a terroristic hotbed. So it was, as critics like Daniel Horowitz noted, this was an obvious outcome. In terms of the broader threat, you've had tens of millions of people steal into the homeland over the southern border. San Diego Sector Chief Hetke recently testified to Congress suggesting that the number of suspected or individuals with suspected terrorist ties has skyrocketed in recent years. And the most damning admission there, and this is an individual who actually wanted to protect the border, but he indicated that the administration has downplayed the threat of terror on the border and has glossed over the fact that untold multitudes of potential terrorist threats have entered into the country. So ahead of the election, there's a great deal to be concerned about. I know that the ongoing or the stronger suggestion is that one of the two assassination attempts on President Donald Trump was foreign-born, Iran-supported. So there's really no telling at this point how many of these potential or prospective terrorists are lurking and ready to do what Tawhidi failed to do.
Yeah, Joe, and I can tell you today from the Washington Post, Donald Trump has requested that he get military aircraft and vehicles in the final weeks of the campaign. And I certainly hope that he does. He said because of the Iranian threat against his life. But at this point, you know, kind of to Danielle's point, I look at it with 3.5 weeks now until the election. And I just hope and pray that we don't have another story that you have to go report on. Thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
When we come back, we'll give you 3 profound statements about Jesus for the weekend. Stay tuned. Let's round out the week with some words from renowned author C.S. Lewis. In a recent piece for Blaze News, Professor Louis Markos dissected arguments for the divinity of Jesus Christ made by C.S. Lewis in his Mere Christianity. And he joins us now to discuss. So, Lewis, in a very, very Cliff Note version, dissect these arguments for us here.
Wonderful. Well, C.S. Lewis is probably best known for his argument that's known as the trilemma, that Jesus was either a liar or a lunatic or a Lord. Those weren't Lewis's words. The great Josh McDowell gave it an LLL to sound like a good American preacher. But the argument goes back to Lewis. And the argument is a lot of people like to say Jesus was just a good prophet, a good teacher, a good rabbi, but nothing more. He wasn't the Son of God. He was just a good teacher. Lewis argues very persuasively that that's the one thing you cannot say about him, because Jesus made all these amazing claims to deity, all the I am speeches, the I have the power to forgive sins. Only God can forgive sins because he's the party that has been offended, right? He makes all these arguments to be equal with God, that we need to follow him and not just his teachings. And so you can't just say he was a good man, because if he was a good man, but not the Son of God, not equal with God, then he was lying when he made those claims. And we do not consider a liar on that scale to be a good man. Now, there's another option, and that is lunatic, that he was crazy and thought he was God. But nobody reading the gospel accounts comes away looking upon Jesus as some kind of a lunatic or a raving madman. And certainly nobody sees him as a deceiver. So he's either liar, lunatic, or Lord. And in a lot of Lewis's works, he points to many areas where Jesus does claim divinity. And I'll tell you, this argument is not just Lewis's argument. This is what you get in the Gospels, because in the Gospel accounts, nobody says he was just a good man. Either they worship him as God and call him Lord, or they think he's crazy. His own family tried to lock him up at one point because they thought he was crazy, or they thought he was a liar and blasphemer. And that's why people kept picking up stones to stone him. And when Caiaphas, the high priest, asked him point blank, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" And Jesus said, "I am," and compared himself to the Son of Man described in Daniel, Caiaphas tears his robe, which is a sign that you are in the presence of blasphemy. So nobody, neither his friends nor his enemies, said he was merely a good man. Either they worshiped him, they dismissed him as crazy, or they put him to death as a blasphemer.
Yeah, I love that argument. And it seems like through a lot of history, this was something that most religions and cultures would have agreed with. They would have either rejected him or people would have accepted him as their Lord. Why do you think in this modern culture, people are kind of drawn to this like feel good feeling of, oh, you know, he's a good man, but they don't want to make him their Lord and so on? Do you think that's just because people don't want to make that commitment? What do you think that is? Because I feel like, you know, traditionally for thousands of years, the religious people, we had the religious wars. People were pretty set on what their views were on these things. But only today do people say kind of cop-out statements like, oh, you know, he was just a good man.
No, that's a good point, because what we've done in the modern times, even those that claim to be Christians often, have reduced Jesus to love and inclusivism. That's all Jesus is. That's his message. That only means. And so not me, but many modern Americans have this idea that the ultimate Christian value is just accepting everything. But that's not what Jesus taught. Do you know, a lot of people like to say today, I only believe in the words in red. In other words, the words Jesus said, and I don't like that St. Paul fellow. Well, the funny thing is, if you read the Bible carefully, you will find that Jesus speaks more about devils and hell than any other character in the Bible. Paul is always talking about grace and salvation. It's Jesus who teaches love, but he also teaches the consequences of rejecting him. I think that we want religion without accountability. To borrow an argument that Lewis makes, what we want is a user-friendly God. We want what some people have called today moralistic therapeutic deism. When it's nice outside and we're feeling good about ourselves, we want to have a nice God and a caring universe. But when we want to do something we know we shouldn't do, it's really nice to know that the universe doesn't care. So if we can domesticate Jesus into merely a good man, that means we can virtue signal and say, oh, we really respect Jesus. He's such a good man. But it removes us from any kind of accountability in our beliefs or our behavior. So I really think it fits with the growing tolerance in the negative sense of the word that we're seeing today, a sort of empty tolerance that says, I'll overlook your sins if you overlook mine.
Louis Markos, thanks so much for coming on the show. We're going to have you back on at some point. Again, I really enjoyed
glad
this.
to be on.
Thanks so much. And Danielle, when he was talking there, it reminded me of the He Gets Us campaign. Did you see that?
Yes,
I know that
during
they
the
rolled
Super
that out during the
Bowl.
Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And it was, oh, this is a loving Jesus. Everything is fine. And it feels to me like there are certainly it's a loving God. We all know this, but there's more to it. There are so many more layers to it.
Yeah. And it seems like, what does love really mean? Is it just saying everything is great, everything is okay, even when it's harming yourself, harming others? What level is permissiveness no longer moral? So I think that's something definitely people today don't want to look to. They don't want to see any kind of judgment. They don't want any words like no. So the real Jesus is probably a little bit controversial.
And you're a mother. You have a 14-month-old now.
Yeah.
You say no all the time.
I have to say no. I don't know if it's sinking in yet, but hopefully gonna get there.
Danielle, thanks so much for coming in and filling in for Matthew. And I just so enjoy when you're here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I know that you're here with the Women for Trump. So what are you guys doing here just to try and get the vote out?
Oh, goodness. Well, there's so much work to be done. We're here in Texas, and one of our biggest focuses is Trump and Cruz, because we cannot let Texas go blue. We cannot lose one of our Senate seats. We cannot allow that to happen. And Chuck Schumer is pouring millions of dollars into this race to unseat Ted Cruz. And so it's not going to happen because of grassroots patriots who are going to go out there and vote.
You're going to go out there, make sure that it happens. We appreciate your efforts. And that's going to do it for us here on the show today. So if you like Blaze News Tonight, be sure to go and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps everybody else out there to find it. And you know what? We'll be back here, whether the chaos happens over the weekend or not. We'll be back here on Monday to break it all down.